to the last session of the last day. I'm very grateful for all of you who made the walkout. So today we'll be talking about a lot about mutation load. I'm going to talk about something I'm going to call the mutation load paradox. It's really motivated by this kind of really interesting finding. This is for humans specifically. There's a lot of mutations in humans. So on average, a new human being, child born, will have 2 new deleterious mutations not found in either of their parents. This is not unique to humans, but I'm focusing on humans because that's who we care about the most. This is really interesting because under a lot of standard population genetics theory, deleterious mutation rates genome-wide, so big U here, UD, larger than 1, should be presenting a pretty serious challenge to population persistence. There's a couple reasons for this. I'm not going to go into too much detail. So one is every time a new deleterious mutation enters the population, in order to get rid of that mutation, you need at least one selective death. So somebody with that mutation has to die because of selection for it to be cleared. So once you hit UD of 1, and everyone's getting a new deleterious mutation, to clear all of those, you would need to kill everyone. Another related problem is that if a deleterious mutation is small enough, it will be invisible to selection and it could drift to fixation. Once you have very high input rates of new deleterious mutations, this could become a serious problem. One of the real problems with this is that the existing answers to population persistence under very high mutation rates like this are unsatisfactory. The classical answer was that there was synergistic epistasis on average among deleterious mutations. This would solve the problem pretty easily, solve kind of both of these problems, because if new deleterious mutations that land on a background with a bunch of other deleterious mutations have much larger effects than they would on their own, then they will be cleared easily by selection, and not only that, but they'll also take a bunch of deleterious mutations with them. So you can clear multiple deleterious mutations with a single selective death, and you can clear down to much smaller effect sizes. The main problem with this is that it's not true. Recent empirical data looking at the epistatic interactions between new deleterious mutations entirely conflicts with this prediction. There are lots of epistatic effects between deleterious mutations, but there's just as much antagonistic epistasis as synergistic, and the average effect is exactly multiple. This is a really serious problem because people have been really worried about mutation load problem for a really long time, especially in humans. People have been worried that human populations might be accumulating mutation load. So this is 1950, Hermann Muller wrote about our load of mutations, in which he first sort of started to describe this problem of pileups of mutations. He was very concerned that this might be happening in human populations and that we would have to do something about it. Not only have people been worried about this in general, but also specifically in modern human populations, we've been worried that something about modern humans is making this even worse. So for example, if there were an increase in the mutation rate recently, then that might make things much worse. So Hermann Muller was very worried about this with regards to ionizing radiation. Probably a bigger problem might be was pointed out by James Crow, which is that as paternal age increases, the amount of mutations that get passed on increases. So if the average age at paternity is increasing in modern human populations, that should be resulting in an increased mutation rate. People have also been worried that modern human populations are decreasing selection by modern advances in agriculture and medicine, public health, etc. If there's a decreased force of selection, you'd expect more stuff piling up. This is Mike Lynch, and just to be clear, this is, where's the date? 2016. This is not something that people have stopped worrying about. People are still very worried that this mutation load problem could be very real for human populations and could be getting much worse. The main thing I do want to point out here, though, is that all of these sort of dire warnings come with very little quantitative predictions to back them up. And the reason for this is that there just isn't a clear theoretical framework for for what you would expect to happen to mutation load under an increasing mutation rate or under a relaxation in selection. So what I'm going to propose is a solution to why we aren't all dead, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the model I use and some of the quantitative predictions I might be able to make. So the title of my talk is that drift barrier theory is the solution to this problem. I don't expect all of you to know what drift barrier theory is, so I'm going to explain it just a little bit. The titled barrier here is just referring to the fact that deleterious mutations with an absolute effect size less than some small number set by the effective population size can't be effectively cleared. They can drift to fixation. This is the barrier. This is the drift barrier that they're talking about. Just to give you some examples, this might be, for example, very small insertions might not have an appreciable effect size, or substitutions that produce slightly less stable proteins might have very small effect sizes, and they might be very difficult for a population to clear with selection. They might drift to fixation. And the solution that drift barrier theory really proposes is that in general, anytime you have this problem where things are landing under the drift barrier, you have to get around this with some kind of novel adaptation. Because you can't deal with all those individual problems with selection, you have to come up with something new. So for example, you might come up with spliceosomes, and now you have introns. And instead of trying to clear all of those introns individually, you just invent a protein and it comes along and it snips everything out. Or you come up with a chaperone protein. Now you can't make all of your proteins perfectly stable, but now you have a new protein that can go along and can help stabilize all these proteins. So this is kind of in general how drift barrier theory works. This could be an answer to the mutation load paradox. You can't prevent all of the very small deleterious mutations, but perhaps single large effect, very rare large effect beneficial mutations could periodically come along and fix all of the stuff that you've been accumulating that you couldn't stop. I just want to point out, this has been studied a little bit before. There's a single theoretical study on this a while ago that appeared promising. It seemed to suggest that beneficial mutations could quite easily counteract the effects of accumulating deleterious mutations. However, it didn't include the effects of linkage or interference, which should be pretty severe and could really strongly degrade the ability of beneficial mutations to fix in the population. So we wanted to be able to include that. So to do that, we wanted to use a simulation method. So we're going to use individual-based forward time simulations. This will let us include all the effects of you might expect from linkage. This is pretty hard to do in terms of computation with very high mutation rates and very high population sizes. So we use these linkage blocks. So we have our 23 diploid chromosomes. We're trying to simulate humans. And the trick is that instead of simulating a bunch of individual base pairs, we lump parts of the chromosomes together into linkage blocks that are effectively non-recombining. So all mutations that happen on a linkage block will be summarized together, and they'll all be passed on together. So for example, I have a couple of deleterious mutations with effect sizes here, a single beneficial mutation, but they all happen on this one linkage block here. So we're just going to multiply them all together. I don't expect you to check my math on this, but that's what all those things multiplied together gives you. And then we're just going to pass on this whole long chunk of the chromosome. And I model explicit crossing over events at the hot spots between the linkage blocks. So, for example, you have a linkage crossing over event happens here, so you'll pass on this chunk of this chromosome and this chunk of that chromosome to your offspring. Then I use realistic population sizes. Everything I'm going to be showing you today will be for n of 100,000. Deleterious mutation rate, genome-wide deleterious mutation rate 2. So on average, every new offspring will get 2 new deleterious mutations. And then I'm going to use an empirical distribution of fitness effects for weakly to moderately deleterious mutations. This is just taken from this large study of modern European humans. Just to show you what this looks like, it looks something like this. So lots of small, weak deleterious mutations, and then a long tail of more deleterious stuff. I don't include lethal mutations. We should have another peek out here, but not that important. And then the important thing here is beneficial mutations to balance this out. The problem with parameterizing beneficial mutations is that empirically, for humans or for most things, the genome-wide beneficial mutation rate and the mean effect size of beneficial mutations is just really completely unknown. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to simulate across a wide range that I consider to be roughly plausible, and then we'll see if in that plausible range beneficial mutations can effectively prevent us from dying. So just for comparison here, I'm gonna say, for no particular reason, that the plausible range for genome-wide beneficial mutation rate is something like 0.001, 0001 to 0.01. So that's about 200 to 20,000 times smaller than the genome-wide deleterious mutation rate, plausibly. Plausible range of mean effect sizes, something like 1% to 0.1%. And I'm using an exponential distribution of fitness effects here, so it'll look something like this, same sort of shape. Yeah. So what's my simulation going to look like? In general, each individual simulation is going to look something like this. You're going to have, I'm going to keep track of fitness over time, over a bunch of generations. Each line would be a single population with some combination of beneficial parameters. I start every individual as having no mutations. So first there's going to be a burn-in phase where mutations first start entering and segregating. They're actually quite fast because there's lots of selection happening, so you get lots of sweeps and stuff very quickly. And then populations are going to either adapt or degrade with some average slope. What I'm going to want to answer here is what rate and effect size of beneficial mutations are sufficient to ameliorate load. So this is the combination of those two beneficial parameters. I'm just showing you the boundaries of what's probably reasonable. And what I'm plotting here is where the slope of those lines I showed before equals 0. So where beneficial mutations are exactly able to ameliorate load. And anything above this, you're fine, you adapt over time. Anything below this, you're dead, you degrade over time. And what you can see, what I want you to take away from this is just that we're probably good. For the vast majority of reasonable beneficial parameter ranges, we survive. Although that's a close call. I'm just going to zoom through this because these are very preliminary results. I don't have much to tell you. All I want to say is I can also make quantitative predictions. So for example, average paternal age in the United States increased by about 3.5 years in the last 30 years or so. And there's some studies to show how much that should increase the rate of mutation to SNPs. So if I were to increase mutation rate by that amount, I could directly predict what would happen. We expect this to just make things way worse. Your rate of adaptation would decrease, your slope would go down. Just a really quick, I wouldn't necessarily trust any of the results I give here. I got them like a week ago. But the point is I can give an exact number to how many generations it would be required to, say, improve fitness by 10% in some reference case, and then in the exact same case, but with a 10% increase. And I don't necessarily want to present this as a real result, but at least preliminarily, it's possible that it may not make things as much worse as people have predicted it will. So just to conclude, rare adaptation for beneficial mutations could balance mutation load, which is the only current theoretical answer to mutation load paradox, and I can make quantitative predictions.